You don't think about it until something small stops working. The power goes out longer than expected, your phone battery drops to 10%, and suddenly something as basic as getting help feels uncertain. Not impossible, just delayed enough to make you realize how much of your safety depends on systems you never see. Most people assume healthcare is always there, like a background service that doesn't fail. Hospitals, pharmacies, supply chains, all operating quietly in the background, giving the illusion that solutions are always one step away. But that stability isn't natural, it's constructed, and like any system built on coordination and logistics, it has points of failure most people never consider. The home doctor positions itself right at that uncomfortable realization. It doesn't start with fear, it starts with a simple premise. What happens when the system doesn't respond in time? Not permanently gone, not some extreme collapse, just unavailable when you actually need it. And that gap, even a short one, is where most people realize they don't have a backup plan. What makes the idea compelling is where it draws its reference point from. Not theory, not simulations, but a real-world breakdown like Venezuela, where medical infrastructure didn't disappear overnight but slowly became unreliable. Doctors weren't replaced, they adapted, improvising methods that worked without consistent electricity, equipment, or pharmaceutical access. That's the core angle behind the home doctor. It presents itself less as a traditional medical book and more as a translation layer between professional knowledge and situations where professional help isn't immediately available. It tries to compress years of clinical experience into something a non-expert can actually use under pressure, but there's something deeper happening here that most people miss. It's not really about learning how to treat a wound or recognize symptoms. It's about shifting where responsibility sits. Modern healthcare trains you to outsource decisions. You feel something, you go somewhere, someone else interprets it for you. This book quietly challenges that dependency. Inside, the content is broad and intentionally practical. It covers how to recognize serious conditions like heart attacks or strokes, what to do in the first minutes before help arrives, and how to handle common injuries or infections at home. It also leans heavily into preparation, from stockpiling basic supplies to understanding which medications remain usable beyond their expiration dates. Some sections go further into territory that feels unconventional by modern standards. Things like using alternative antiseptics, managing without refrigeration for certain drugs, or even revisiting older medical practices that were abandoned more for convenience than inefficiency. That's where the tone shifts from familiar to slightly uncomfortable, because it forces you to question whether newer always means better, or just easier. The discussion around antibiotics and medication stockpiling is a good example of this tension. On one hand, it acknowledges how critical these drugs are. On the other, it exposes how fragile access to them really is. The idea isn't to replace doctors, it's to reduce the window where you're completely dependent on them, and that's where the real value, or risk depending on how you see it, comes in. This kind of information gives you more control, but it also gives you more responsibility. Knowing how to act in a medical situation is not the same as being trained to handle it. The book walks a careful line between empowerment and overconfidence, and whether it succeeds depends on how the reader approaches it. There's also a subtle but important shift in how it frames preparedness. Most commercial solutions sell convenience. Pills, services, subscriptions, all designed to remove friction. This goes in the opposite direction. It introduces friction on purpose, because friction is where understanding happens. It asks you to think ahead, to prepare, to accept that not everything can be solved instantly. That trade-off is easy to ignore when everything works. But the moment something doesn't, even briefly, that lack of preparation becomes visible. And that's the psychological hook this entire concept relies on. Not fear of disaster, but recognition of dependence. The bonuses included, like guides on wild edibles or natural remedies, reinforce that same philosophy. They're not really about replacing modern systems, they're about creating parallel options. Redundancy instead of reliance. Having more than one way to solve the same problem. Of course, this approach isn't for everyone. It requires time, attention, and a willingness to engage with things most people prefer to ignore. It also demands a certain level of skepticism, not just toward systems, but toward your own assumptions about safety and preparedness, because the uncomfortable truth is that most people aren't unprepared due to lack of access. They're unprepared because they've been conditioned to expect access. And those are two very different problems. The home doctor doesn't fix the system, and it doesn't pretend to. What it does is shift the question from, will help be available, to, what happens if it isn't? And once that question is taken seriously, the The way you look at everyday health decisions starts to change. You start noticing how many solutions you rely on without understanding them. How many outcomes depend on timing, availability, and infrastructure you don't control. And once you see that, it's hard to go back to assuming everything will just work when you need it. If that realization feels familiar, then it's probably worth looking at what's actually inside. There's a link below where you can check the full breakdown, and it's better to go through it now than when you're already in a situation where options are limited.